Mindy Todd will interview Lawrence tonight. Mindy's a pioneer in broadcast journalism. She started her career as a midday DJ at WARE in Ware, Massachusetts. She quickly advanced to host of the Morning Drive show, which in 1981 made her one of the few women in broadcasting to anchor her own morning show. She's now the host and producer of The Point on WCAI, which examines critical issues for the Cape and the islands. During her 30 years in the industry, she's received numerous awards, including most recently her 5th National Public Radio News Directors Incorporated Award for Best Call-In Program and Best Interview. Thank you. And it is my great pleasure to welcome the multi-talented Lawrence O'Donnell. He is a writer, a producer, an actor, and host. After graduating from Harvard, O'Donnell started his political career as legislative aide to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York. He spent 6 years working for the senator, quickly moving from an aide to the director of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works and also the Senate Finance Committee. When he left the Hill, Lawrence went on to conquer the television industry, working as a writer and producer of everyone's favorite show, NBC's The West Wing. In one episode, I believe he also played President Bartlett's father, yes? Good old days. Among his many awards and recognitions, Lawrence won an Emmy for Outstanding Drama Series in 2001 for his writing of The West Wing. He's now host of his own show, The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC. Many of us in this room won't go to bed without first getting the last word from Lawrence. I know there's one woman here who stays up, that you're her first word in the evening. She stays up much of the night listening to cable news because I think she gets a little unsettled having watched it. Lawrence has also authored 2 books. In his current book, Playing with Fire, he brings his extraordinary background in politics and entertainment to the 1968 presidential election. So we're thrilled to have them both with us here tonight to discuss this amazing book. So please join me in welcoming them.
I think you've got some fans here.
Yeah, you know, this is such a uniquely Vineyard event because of one thing that I've never seen before anywhere, anytime. The intern got a round of applause. She has no idea. She's out front right now, and she doesn't have any idea that she got, the first time in history, an intern gets a round of applause, and she just came in the back room. Let's do it again. There she is.
So how many have read the book? How many have read the book? Okay, but most of us, I think, looking around the room, were around in the 60s, so we recall that. What I found interesting was how many things I sort of forgotten reading the book. But I wanted to read something that you wrote. When the 1960s began, parents worried about their kids maybe drinking too much at the senior prom. By the end of the decade, parents worried about their kids getting arrested for possessing marijuana or dying from a heroin overdose or being killed in Vietnam for a theory, the domino theory, that if one country fell to communism, then another would, and another, and another. No one was left unchanged by the chaos of the 1960s. That really kind of, chaos really does describe that decade. And I'm wondering, what prompted you to bring us back to that presidential election in 1968?
You know, it's really, it's mostly my West Wing background that pulled me back to it, because I was just looking in the That was the last long-form writing I did, was hour-long television. And I'd been trying to get back to writing books again, and I finally had this day job that would allow me, I thought, enough time to write another book. And when I finally started focusing on it, it was the dramatist in me that really picked the topic, because I know that by that time people were expecting something political from me. And so I just wanted to tell the most dramatic political story I know, the most dramatic by far. And that is, it was about 90 seconds reflection that landed me on 1968, because either one of the two stunning and kind of world-stopping assassinations in 1968 during that presidential campaign would have been the single largest event, not only of a presidential campaign as a standalone event, but it would have been the single largest event of a decade. And so, you know, Bobby Kennedy's assassination or Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, so the campaign was not only the most dramatic political campaign of our history, really, and the most kind of cinematic in dramatic terms, but the decade itself, the decade that it was stuck in, as you just described, was an extraordinary period, the likes of which we haven't seen since. And you know, we have this vague way in which we identify the 70s and distinguish them from the 80s, and another vague way that we distinguish in our heads the 80s from the 90s. But when you really stare at it, after the 1960s, what you're really talking about are some, you know, relatively minor temporary shifts in music and relatively minor adjustments in wardrobe and what the cars looked like. The 1960s was this stunning, high-speed pace of change that at other periods in our history would take 50 years to get through. I mean, if you were to just think about the mindset of the Alabama segregationist in 1961, that was as locked down a human mind as existed on the planet. And some of them, many of them, not most of them, but a real significant number of them, by 1969, were not segregationists anymore. That meant a Berlin Wall came down inside their heads. And that kind of change in the world, in the way people look at the world, used to take a much longer period of time. But the 60s just rocketed at very, very high speed. I was actually just having lunch with a friend of mine here on the Vineyard today who's writing a book that covers that period of his own experience, and we both talked about the challenge of how do you do it. And I think I did what I could. I think there's a better version of rendering the 60s than I did in this book, because it's an enormous challenge, and it's there for authors, I think, to come to and come back to for a very long time.
And of course, the characters in this election. Let's start with President Johnson, a bully, no doubt, a man used to getting his way. Talk a little bit about President Johnson, and also that micromanaging that he does. You know, we'll see who my vice president is going to be, and that was something else that we forget. Back then, the conventions, you a lot of times didn't know who was going to be the president or vice president until the convention.
Yeah, it's because they didn't really use presidential primaries in those days. Most states did not have presidential primaries, even in 1968, and fewer of them had them in 1964. And Lyndon Johnson was the presumed nominee anyway for the Democrats in 1964. But you'll remember that we did not have a vice president of the United States from November 22nd, 1963 until the next inauguration day. And the government, by the way, realized there was a problem. There had been no provision made for what happens if the vice president, we know what to do if the president dies or is assassinated. The vice president moves up, but we made no provision to fill the vice presidential slot. So it was next filled by the election of 1964, and Lyndon Johnson, in the end, came down to a choice of running mates: Hubert Humphrey, the senior senator from Minnesota, or Gene McCarthy, the junior senator from Minnesota. And Lyndon Johnson tortured both of them, really tortured both of them through this thing. And you can see why when you look at the wider way he played his games. He wanted to dominate this person, and he used humiliation as a domination technique. He didn't do it as publicly as the current president does it with his attorney general, for example, and other people, but he was privately doing some very similar dynamics. And so that was a lesson to me that I didn't know. I was in high school in 1968, so there's a lot that happened before that that I didn't know that I discovered in this research. And so Gene McCarthy had a kind of personal resentment toward LBJ for the way he was treated in 1964, but that really did not inform in any way the way McCarthy dealt with LBJ. In fact, the deference was really quite stunning when you compare it to our world today, because when Gene McCarthy was finally convinced, which he was extremely reluctant to do, but he was finally convinced to run a presidential campaign in the Democratic Party in 1968 as a challenge to the Vietnam War by running against the incumbent Democratic president, something we'd never seen before. When he was finally convinced to do that, and he finally makes this most dramatic presidential campaign announcement that has happened certainly by that time in my lifetime, because all previous presidential campaign announcements were all expected, and it was all the usual suspects who would be running at that particular time. There was never a surprise in who the candidates were. So McCarthy goes into this giant caucus room in the Russell Senate office building, where Senator John Kennedy announced his presidential campaign, where Senator Robert Kennedy announced his presidential campaign after Gene McCarthy did. McCarthy goes in there, and he doesn't even announce that he's running for president. He says he's going to put his name on the ballot in a few states in the primaries, and he hasn't really decided which ones, and he doesn't know if he's going to run in New Hampshire, and he never says the words Lyndon Johnson. Never says those words. That's how verbally deferential and externally deferential the McCarthy challenge actually was to the president of his own party in those primaries.
Yeah. And LBJ was not too happy. But talk about the New Hampshire primary. He came in second. Nobody expected that.
No one expected him to come in second, and I didn't know he came in second until about 30 years later. I thought he won because I was in high school, and my brother Kevin, who's here, was a volunteer for Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire, and he was one of the kids who got clean for Gene and shaved the beard and went up to New Hampshire to knock on doors and try to get votes for McCarthy. And the news media sensation in the Boston Globe and in the Boston TV coverage and in the national TV coverage was that McCarthy had won. But what had really happened is he'd gotten over 40% against an incumbent president of his own party in a primary, and that was stunning. And for the world, it was stunning for Lyndon Johnson. It was stunning for Bobby Kennedy, who then jumped into the race at the end of that week. The vote is Tuesday in New Hampshire. Bobby jumps in Saturday. That's how important that vote was.
And let's talk, since we mentioned not every state had primaries, and Bobby Kennedy, once he jumped in, he was very selective on the primaries. He won because his thing was gotta win.
His thing was gotta win, and there were so many elements of that. One was no Kennedy had ever lost an election. No Kennedy had ever given a concession speech on an election night, ever. And so that was one burden. And Bobby turned out in Oregon to be the very first Kennedy to lose an election night. He lost the Oregon primary week before he wins the California primary. And he had, so he had that burden, and he had the burden of being in possession of the most enormous political capital that has ever existed in the history of our politics. And that was the enormous benefit that he could get, the enormous head start that he had with voters and in polls, because he was the brother of the assassinated president. And he was running in a way that felt like a restoration of this tragically ended presidency. So no candidate in our history had ever had an advantage like that, and no candidate in our history had ever had a burden like that. It was the most enormous burden that anyone ever carried into a campaign. He had to wonder, and did, would he be assassinated by running for president? Jackie Kennedy actually whispered to a friend that she believed that if Bobby ran, the same thing would happen to Bobby that happened to Jack. So it was in the air in that family. Teddy worried about that. It was a very serious concern. Gene McCarthy, nobody else, Nixon, Rockefeller, these people deciding to run for president, assassination didn't cross any of their minds. They didn't have to think, will there be a crazy copycat out there who wants to get the next Kennedy on the way to the presidency? So the burdens on Bobby were actually enormous, really, truly enormous. And so he struggled. He thought about running for president a year before Gene McCarthy decided to run for president. He was asked to run for president by the liberal activists, Allard Lowenstein especially, who were trying to get a candidate to go on the ballot in Democratic primaries so that they could put the Vietnam War on the ballot. The candidate they wanted was Bobby. He thought about it, decided not to do it. Then they came back to him, and he thought about it some more, and he decided not to do it. And this cycle went on for months and months. Ethel, his wife, actually wanted him to do it. And there was a point where she helped the kids make a handwritten sign that they hung out of the bedroom window at Hickory Hill that he could see when he was driving in the driveway that said, "Run, Bobby, run." And "Run, Bobby, run" was the chant that Bobby Kennedy would hear everywhere he would go. In a hall like this, which would have had people overflowing out into the tennis courts in the street, wherever he went, long before he gave a hint that he was interested in running for president, every crowd always chanted, "Run, Bobby, run." They wanted it without any doubt, and they wanted it more than he did until he finally got to the point of making that decision.
You talk about Bobby Kennedy's burden. We should sort of mention his upbringing. He's the middle child. He was not his dad's favorite. His dad didn't put a lot of stuff. He was his mom's favorite. That played a lot into who he was as well.
Yeah, he was clearly the most sensitive of the group. And the brothers all had this very hard edge to them, this very hard competitive edge. And what in those days was called a kind of manly edge. There was this definition of what manliness was and how to exhibit it. And there was no public example of sensitivity, for example. There was no public example prior to the mid-1960s, and probably John Lennon might have been the very first, where there was a really a widely famous and celebrated man whose image was based largely on his own poetic sensitivity. And so there was no model for that. And it's really interesting to watch Bobby Kennedy's poetic and sensitive side, which was always there when he was a kid, and was in the family lore, mommy's favorite, or at least the one mommy thought she had to protect, the other one she didn't think she had to protect. But there was also this very hard edge to Bobby Kennedy that people working in the Senate when he was a staff member there could tell you about in the 1950s. And he was the campaign manager of his brother's successful presidential campaign. And there has never been a campaign manager of a successful presidential campaign who wasn't really, really tough and really, really ruthless. You know, every one of them has to have that capacity. And so those words were always stuck on Bobby, but it was fascinating for me to trace his evolution politically in the 1960s. And there's a certain image out there of there being a kind of moderate Democrat, tough guy, some would say conservative Democrat in the 1950s, tough guy, Bobby Kennedy, who then sees that liberal is the way to go somewhere in the middle of the 1960s, and he just cynically switches to this. And this is absolutely untrue. He was undergoing the evolution that all men his age in particular, he's in his 40s, men his age were going through in the 1960s. In 1961, you could not find, other than in some pacifist group somewhere, which even then would be hard to find, you couldn't find an American man who had any kind of opinions against the way we have used the American military. That didn't exist. There was no peace movement. There was no anti-war movement. There were people by the end of the 1960s. My uncle was a general. By the end of the 1960s, general in the Army, he was opposed to the Vietnam War. By the beginning of the 1960s, he was completely in favor of it. There wasn't any kind of cynical decision that he made moving toward the left. He did lose a son. He lost my cousin Johnny, who was West Point graduate in 1968 in Vietnam. And so those years changed everyone. Bobby in 1963, before there's any hint he's going to run for office in New York, for the New York Senate seat, where, by the way, this didn't help him. In 1963, he goes out to North Dakota. He's the Attorney General of the United States. Jack Kennedy lost North Dakota, as the Democrat always did, by more than 10 points. There was no hope of Jack Kennedy coming back to North Dakota and winning North Dakota in 1964. In other words, there's no political benefit for the Attorney General to go out to North Dakota and make a speech to a convention of Native American tribes that have gathered in North Dakota. And Bobby Kennedy makes a speech to those tribes that if someone had read it at Standing Rock in 2016 in North Dakota, when that protest was going on, every word of it would have applied to what was being protested there then. Bobby Kennedy was so far ahead of American liberalism catching up to the Native American cause, and no one noticed. So when you really study his passage through the decade, it all makes sense. It all becomes very human, which is to say we all have multiple sides. None of us can be described with one adjective. And the more interesting you are, the more complicated the set of adjectives become.
I want to talk about the Vietnam War for a second here. Talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, that incident. That was something I did not know.
The Gulf of Tonkin was a truly stunning development because the Gulf of Tonkin incident was reported to have been an attack by the North Vietnamese on the United States Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin, off of Vietnam, in international waters. And there are two things to know about it. One, basically, nothing happened. There was this flurry of telegrams coming into the Pentagon that were from the ships that were describing an actual attack underway. And what they believed at the time were torpedoes headed for these American ships. But at the end of it all, at the very end of all of this cable traffic, which goes on for over 12 hours, the final telegram is, oh, never mind. It was a mistake. Our instruments were off. We were reading, the radar was reading wrong. Never mind, forget about it. Now, the person in the Pentagon whose job it was to collect every one of those telegrams coming in describing the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which the President of the United States then used as a reason to dramatically escalate the war in Vietnam and send hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam. Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which everyone in the Senate except for one senator voted for. Gene McCarthy voted for it. The one senator who voted against it, Wayne Morse, lost his reelection because of it, because he wasn't with the war. That entire thing turned out to be false, and the person who was reading every one of these telegrams, who believed that an attack was underway, and then when he gets to the final telegram that comes into the Pentagon and he sees, oh, nothing happened, that was Daniel Ellsberg. That was his job. So he's reading that, and he saw what his president and what his government did with that information. Those were the first pages of the Pentagon Papers for Daniel Ellsberg. He knew that these would not be the only pages, and so, he stayed with that and eventually revealed the totality of those kinds of falsehoods that were delivered to the public about the Vietnam War.
Let's talk about some of the Republican candidates here. Let's talk about Richard Nixon, first of all. And we remember you don't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. Remember that when he lost the governor's election?
Yeah, so Richard Nixon becomes, in 1960, the very first vice president in history to lose a presidential campaign. He becomes the very first. And oh, by the way, as long as we're on that little historical note, 8 years later, Hubert Humphrey becomes the second to Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon, as the sitting vice president, loses by less than 1%. And for who knows what happened in Chicago with those ballots that came in very late from Richard Daley. So he loses. He does actually quite a dignified thing and doesn't ask for a recount. I now realize, I always used to think that Nixon did that was a graceful moment for Nixon, that when JFK wins by less than 1% of the vote and he squeaks by because of the votes in Cook County in Illinois, where their friends, Richard Daley, mayor of Chicago, was running the whole thing, that he could have called for a recount. Why didn't he call for a recount? Well, as I researched, I discovered, well, the reason he didn't call for a recount, as he told people, was if Daley could fix election night, he can fix a recount. So, it was more practical than grace, it turns out. So then he surprises everyone and, basically runs for a demotion. He's been vice president. He runs for governor of California 2 years later, and he loses. And that's when the most bitter exit in American political history takes place. And I was a little kid, I can remember this on TV, where Richard Nixon, in this final press conference after the losing the governor's race in California, he says, well, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore, to the assembled reporters. They weren't so lucky. He came back. And he actually rethought that just months later and immediately started scheming months later about his climb back. And his climb back, when you realize for Nixon, the 1968 campaign began in 1963. And you look at the work he did to re-endear himself to a party, which for a loser is very hard to do. And the way he manipulated the Goldwater candidacy to his own benefit in '64, knowing that Goldwater would lose, so that this would then position him as the good, reliable Republican for '68. Everything Nixon planned by himself, by the way, by himself, no Svengali advisor doing this. He planned things in 1963 that paid off in '68, 1964, 1965, '66, every single year that paid off in '68. He was, as an actual candidate, the most masterful political campaign tactician of all of the candidates.
I think I read somewhere, though, that he said he learned his dirty tricks from Bobby Kennedy, from the campaign with Jack Kennedy. But he also got a sense of humor. He sort of reinvented himself. So when he went out on that, this is my last press conference, when he came back, the first press conference, he sort of at the end said, oh, and this will not be my last press conference. So he he sort of reinvented himself.
Yeah, and people in this room might remember that Richard Nixon appeared on what was the hippest TV show of the time,
yeah.
Laugh-In, saying "Sock it to me," which was the catchphrase of that show. And that was, I mean, that really, if you look at the history of television entertainment's intersection with politics, that's a really big moment. That's a huge moment. Because that's not, and then you cut to, Donald Trump is hosting Saturday Night Live while he's running for president. That's, that Trump thing, the germ of it was back there. And, but, Nixon occupies the first sentence of this book, not just because he won the election, and it's because he met Roger Ailes in the 1968 presidential campaign. So it's Roger Ailes and Richard Nixon who appear in the first sentence of the book, with Ailes meeting Nixon in a makeup chair at the Mike Douglas show, which was a TV talk show of its day. And Nixon is kind of complaining about why am I doing TV like this? I should be doing serious shows like Meet the Press. And Ailes, who's a TV expert certainly compared to Nixon, just lights into him and criticizes him for everything he's done wrong on TV throughout his entire career. And this is where Richard Nixon really gets credit, both as a person and as a politician. He loved hearing that. He loved hearing this Roger Ailes angry analysis of every stupid thing Nixon's ever done on TV. And he lures this guy Ailes into his presidential campaign. And so, the president you have tonight is thanks to Richard Nixon getting Roger Ailes out of show business. Because Ailes elects Nixon, he gets Nixon reelected, he gets Ronald Reagan elected and reelected, works on those campaigns, he gets George H.W. Bush elected, and then in the mid-1990s, he quits politics, if you can call it that, and he creates for Rupert Murdoch in the late summer of 1996 a thing that they've decided to call Fox News. And Fox News becomes this Republican television channel whose entire mission is to support Republican candidates and always the Republican nominee for president. Without Fox News, without Roger Ailes' version of Fox News that only Roger Ailes could create, Donald Trump would not be president tonight.
One of the things in 1968 with the news media, what was private remained private. I'm thinking of Nelson Rockefeller and Happy. There was a story there, but nobody really touched on those things then.
Yeah, so it turns out, the Trump phenomenon is, you can explain it, you can keep going back as far as you want, really, when you start to try to explain it. My first attempt to explain it was when cable news was being accused of doing a terrible job of covering the Trump campaign, and therefore that's helping Trump. And my explanation for that was, yes, I agree. And so yeah, you can blame cable news, and then you can blame Sarah Palin, or McCain's choice of Sarah Palin, for teaching Republicans how to defend ignorance and inexperience, because you did want some batting practice on that before the big one. And you can just keep going backward, through your culture. And I mean your culture, I mean reality TV, I mean all of it, because what's happening in all of it as you move backward in time is that we're throwing, without knowing it at any of these points, another straw on a camel's back. We don't even know there's a camel there, and we don't know these are straws. And so cable news, the reality TV game, which was created entirely by Hollywood liberals, by the way, all of it. All of that programming comes out of the offices of Hollywood liberals. They just think it's cheaper than hiring actors and expensive writers and expensive directors, and it gets pretty good numbers, so let's do it. All of the great, crimes against society start with an innocent thought, and reality TV is one of those. So look at what it is. It's, oh, I know, how about a show about a guy who fires people? You go, okay, great. Now, if you were pitching that show in the entertainment division as a TV drama, people would go, well, no, that's horrible. People hate the guy who fires people. You said, okay, how about a show about, this horrible mother, and she calls her kid Honey Boo Boo, and the kid is in beauty contests, and the kid really shouldn't be, and it's just a horrible parenting show. What about these kids in the Jersey Shore who never paid attention in math class or any other class? And so what reality TV is this giant assembly of people who you would never, ever want to live next door to. Ever, 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 ever. Those horrible so-called housewives throwing furniture at each other. And the frame of reality TV says, look at them and laugh. And get a huge kick out of it when Donald Trump says that thing to Gary Busey. The firing guy becomes this amusement, And so we have had so many cracks in what used to be definitional components of the culture. Things like, well, you don't brag, you don't boast. That's a bad thing, and then you come along and there's a guy saying, I'm very smart and I've made a lot of money. Well, you had to have decades of kind of public bragging wearing down the culture, to accept all of that. And so the numbers of things that I think are actually in the thousands that add up eventually to soften a society and soften a civilization to the point where someone can get up and tell crazy, crazy lies and eke out this miracle in the Electoral College. It's a giant set of contributions, and the whole culture played a part far beyond just politics.
Reality TV is
And
not
I forget
reality.
what the question was.
I was talking about
So if
privacy.
any of you, when it's question time, want to ask that question again, I might have something.
I'll ask it again about the privacy. The candidates.
Yeah, and there was
private
that
lives
privacy.
remain private.
Yeah, so we broke the privacy rules of politics in 1988 with Gary Hart, and Miami Herald decided we're going to put a candidate under physical surveillance. We're going to hire a van. We're going to put photographers in it. We're going to follow him around, and we're going to see if we can find him cheating on his wife. And they found they got these pictures that they thought made the case, and that was the end of Gary Hart. And it changed totally, what the news media's relationship to privacy was. And by the way, the news media never had a meeting. They never sat down and said, okay, we will now ask them about their private lives, about extramarital stuff and all that stuff. It just happened in the dumb evolutionary accidents of that kind of thing. And and then you get to the Clinton years, and Bill Clinton just shovels ammunition their way. Just go, do you have enough? Here's some more. I mean, it looked bad in New Hampshire with those Jennifer Flowers tapes, but don't worry, I'm not done. And politics, by the way, is a very simple thing. Everybody in politics has enemies. The question for your candidate or the question for your office holder is exactly how much of the ammunition did you give them? Don't tell me it's unfair when they start saying X or Y. Tell me how much of the ammunition you gave them and how much of this was within your power to not give them. And so, Bill Clinton ends up behaving as if it's 1961 and no one is keeping a log of who's visiting JFK, in the West Wing, which they weren't. I mean, Hugh Sidey was the Time magazine White House correspondent. He personally saw Marilyn Monroe in the West Wing of the White House while he was waiting to interview the president. His report in Time magazine did not include a reference to Marilyn Monroe. That's how the rules worked back then. And I am not sure we're better off in the rules change.
Looking back to when LBJ was president, we didn't have financial disclosure. The Senate Ethics Committee was still 5 years away. We're saying private lives are private. It was a very different place.
It was wild. It was a cash business. It was a cash business. If we were sitting here in 1967 or something, and I asked for a show of hands of how many people have contributed money to a presidential campaign. The most we'd see, maximum of one, very, very, very unlikely. It was a cash business because there were no receipts, there was no reporting. We have no idea, no record, no estimate, nothing about how much money did Franklin Roosevelt raise to run for president. We have no idea. How much did LBJ raise? We don't have the vaguest idea. We do know where both of them came from, though. FDR had to raise money to run for governor in New York City. And there are competing accounts as to whether Lucky Luciano or Frank Costello was a bigger contributor to Tammany Hall-based FDR campaigns. And same thing with Lyndon Johnson, where there was a tremendous amount of cash money in Texas politics and then in all politics. And so, all of that changed much later, post-Watergate. One thing it meant is that for people like Lyndon Johnson, who were, I think, very mistakenly called a master of the Senate, it's indescribable how much easier the job was then. It's impossible to give you even the slightest feel for it. I mean, okay, so you're trying to pass Medicare, okay, which is really this gigantic, socialistic program that you're adding simply as an amendment to the Social Security Act, but it's gigantic. How much is it going to cost? That is the question that Lyndon Johnson was never asked. Never, forget what his answer was. Nobody asked it in those days. There was no budget committee. There was no congressional budget office. There was no estimate of how much it would cost. No, nothing. So the idea of, the work you had to do to get a vote for Medicare versus the work you had to do to get a vote for something like Hillary Clinton's failed health care bill or Barack Obama's successful health care bill, it's just incomparable. There were no budget rules in the Senate. I mean, there's a thing in the Senate called a budget point of order. It's a parliamentary rule that did not exist in Lyndon Johnson's day. The number of new parliamentary rules that didn't exist in Lyndon Johnson's day is greater than the total number that did exist when he was there. And so, it's a little bit like mastering a single-engine aircraft, as opposed to a space shuttle. So everything, every single thing about the workings of government was much, much simpler. And so what you were always much closer to was a yes or no vote on the merits, on the actual issue. The votes tended to turn on the issue. These guys are filibustering a civil rights bill because they absolutely do not want black people voting and certainly not voting in their states. It was very clear. They weren't doing some tricky parliamentary thing or some fancy budget item thing, none of that, which is the way it's all done now. It's all done through all these mystifying, clouds of parliamentary weirdness. None of which exist, and it's incredibly complex stuff. I mean, really deeply complex stuff, and it takes years to learn it. And there's two different levels of it. One is the Senate floor, which is the most complex parliamentary environment of all, and the other is the individual committees, each of which have their own rules. I mean, I ran two of them. I ran the Environment and Public Works Committee for a while, and then I ran the Senate Finance Committee, the most complex of them all, for years. And I had to have the committee's parliamentarian at my side all day, and to say, can we do that? And so none of that existed. None of that existed back in the kind of procedurally innocent 1960s in government.
And not to mention Lady Bird and her radio station.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they got so rich. The Johnson family, and there was no financial disclosure, right? So, now every senator has to release a financial disclosure form, and it has to even show gifts that they've received if it's not from a family member. If you give a senator a necktie, they're going to have to declare it on their gift form and financial disclosure form, and they have to disclose their spouse's assets. And they do it within ranges. It's a lack of specificity. The original concept of that, by the way, was that it's very hard to say exactly how much my IBM stock is worth because the price fluctuates. I mean, that's the basic principle that's behind the reason you always hear that these are just kind of ranges that they put in there. The other notion was that, we don't really have to write these rules for Rockefellers. Well, it turned out they did. Eventually, J. Rockefeller did become a senator. But they were writing them for people who kind of had worked their way up in politics or came from substantial amounts of family money, but not indescribably huge amounts of money. And that includes some of the people who are in a government now. And so these disclosure forms now are incredibly unsatisfactory because they were designed for kind of much less complex ranges of wealth.
Back to Lady Bird and a radio station, though, it was her husband who went to CBS and said, hey, we want to be a CBS affiliate.
This is so good to have someone who both asks and remembers the question. And, so Lady Bird Johnson, we always read about them as being Lady Bird's radio stations. Who was that? Well, that was just a shell game to pretend that, the senator from Texas was not buying up the radio stations in Texas. He was. They were calling them ladybirds. And then, so the wealth is accruing to both of them, enormous wealth. And then Lyndon Johnson says to CBS, I'd like these stations to be CBS affiliates. And big surprise, they become CBS affiliates. It got to the point, they used to auction these things off. The airwaves would be, you'd auction off a TV channel, you'd auction off a radio channel. It got to the point where they had an auction for one of the channels in Austin, Texas, and no one bid. Just one bid from Lady Bird Johnson. And everybody else just went, it's ridiculous. We're not even going to try. And none of that. There was no ethics committee to look at that. They weren't violating any rules because there were no rules. There were no ethical rules of the Senate at the time. And so, the simplicity of life then for these people was really extraordinary. And what that means in modern languages, what they could get away with was breathtaking, and we'll never know.
How about questions from the audience? Anybody have a question they'd like to pose? Right over here, sit there. Yeah, go ahead, stand up.
Yeah, I have a question since
Oh, wait a minute, you got a microphone coming.
you're an expert on Senate procedure. Your colleague Chris Matthews went on a rant a couple of weeks ago about Brett Kavanaugh, basically saying that the Democrats are wusses and they're not going to do what it takes to stop him. Indivisible is getting everybody all riled up about calling their senators. They're thinking that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are going to flip. They're not. And Howie Klein, who you probably know, his blog Down with Tyranny, he says the only way to do it is for the Senate to deny, the Democrats to deny the Senate a quorum and just not show up. Do you think that that's possible? And do you think there's any likelihood the Democrats are going to do it?
No, it's not possible, and they won't do it. Is everyone satisfied with that, or do you want a quorum? All right, so here's the deal. Lunch today was with someone I used to work with in the Senate, and one of the things that came up whenever you end up talking about the Senate is this just kind of amazing thing about how no one in the House understands the Senate, and no one in the Senate understands the House. It's as if Nantucket were on the other side of Africa from here, and it's unbelievably weird. It's the strangest thing I've ever encountered. I'll just as a resume footnote, I will point out that Chris Matthews worked in the House of Representatives. No, there is absolutely no parliamentary procedure that can stop this thing, and I was certain of that as soon as it erupted as a public issue. But, I'm old and I forget a lot, so I spoke to the Senate parliamentarian about it. And I spoke to other parliamentarians. There's more than one. I mean, Schumer has a parliamentarian and McConnell has a parliamentarian. So let's deal with, say, the quorum thing, which is the latest gimmick that somebody came up with, and Kevin De Leon, who is challenging Dianne Feinstein in California in her reelection, is enamored with this. And Kevin was the president of the California Senate, and I defer to him on all California Senate parliamentary questions, but he knows less about the United States Senate than anyone who helps park the cars in the Senate parking garage. So here's the way a quorum works. And watch C-SPAN. Now you're going to have to watch C-SPAN for this, okay? Because the lesson is on C-SPAN every single day in the Senate. Just turn it on C-SPAN 2, United States Senate, and don't move. You can't leave the House. This is going to take a while. If they're all talking, then you're just going to have to be patient. You're going to wait for them to stop. And at some point they will, because the senators, enough of them will end up going to a luncheon. So there'll be almost no action on the Senate floor, or actually down to zero action on the Senate floor. And what happens then when you're watching C-SPAN 2 is you hear this drone of a roll call of names to which no one's really answering. And it's a very slow drone. And so what happens when someone then wants to restart the engine on this basically idling vehicle is that someone will walk onto the Senate floor and say, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum. At which time that thing you were hearing in the background becomes serious. It's now an official quorum call, only because it was requested. So, the only way you will actually get a quorum call in the United States Senate is to request a quorum call, which means a Democrat would have to come on to this Senate floor that they are all boycotting, much, by the way, to the just thrill and excitement of their constituents in Missouri who think that's great, that Claire McCaskill's not going to work today. They think that looks great. So all the Democrats have left the building. Some Democrat's going to have to suggest the absence of a quorum, okay? So that won't happen. Then, if you actually get a quorum call to which the Republicans cannot technically muster the quorum, then they can, now that the Democratic senator has left, the next thing you hear when you're watching C-SPAN after someone's asked for a quorum call, suggested the absence of a quorum, start doing that, the next words you will hear is, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with. And every single time it is, okay? So the Democrats have left the building. Now the Republicans ask unanimous consent that you stop doing this stupid quorum thing, and you stop. And now, with no Democrats in the building, they can vote on the Supreme Court justice by unanimous consent without even having a roll call vote. So, I mean, there's nothing in any of these procedures. I would say, because of the kind of stuff you've heard people say, what the Democrats are under is the pressure to look like they're doing something when it's impossible to do anything. And that's a political pressure that each party finds themselves under at different times. The truth is, it is entirely up to Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and no one else. That's it. And every moment of putting pressure on the Democrats is a moment when you're not putting pressure. Susan Collins loves this. I mean, Susan Collins, I'm sure, loved what Chris had to say that day. And I'm sure Lisa Murkowski loved it. Because any time you're saying it's not up to Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, they're thrilled. They are getting off that hook, and they're getting to play this the way Susan Collins especially has always played it, which is I'm pro-choice, and Roe versus Wade is settled law, and now let me vote for the next person who's opposed to it, next guy who's opposed to it, because they're all guys.
Another question? Right back here, and then we'll go over here.
More parliamentary questions, I hope.
No. Did you learn anything about RFK's assassin, Sirhan Sirhan. It was always so puzzling.
You know, the name Sirhan Sirhan does not appear in my book. And I didn't know that was going to happen until I got to the scene and until I wrote the scene. Because this will sound strange, but it's not important to an understanding of what happened that night. And it's so semi-accidental. I mean, literally, Ethel Kennedy was on this side of Bobby on the stage, and Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez were over here. And the original plan was, for what they were doing after this, they were going to leave the stage on this side, and the cars were going to be out there. And then there was a last-minute decision made of, let's go this way through the kitchen, because there are a couple of reporters we want Bobby to talk to for tomorrow's newspapers on the way out. And Sirhan's over there. And if they'd gone this way, Bobby Kennedy's probably elected president in 1968. And so the amount of in what really happened there, in what really matters about what really happened there, it was really in my mind exactly, but I mean exactly, what Jackie Kennedy thought was going to happen, like exactly, which was simply that this infection was going to reach into another brain, and it was going to get Bobby in the same way that it got Jack.
We had a question over here somewhere. Who had their hand up? Right there. Right here. Yep.
Thank you very much for coming this evening. Would you speak a little bit about your other book, Is It Deadly Violence, about the incident that happened in Boston a number of years ago, your family's involvement in it, and how that connects to the world we live in today?
I would love to. The first book I wrote is called Deadly Force. It was 35 years ago. It just came out in paperback last week. 35 years to get a book into paperback. I don't know. It was a minor bestseller in Boston at the time because it was a story about Boston police, and it was a very personal story. It was also the very first book written about the problems associated with police use of deadly force, which has now become a massive story in this country, starting only 4 years ago with the killing of Michael Brown, and then the killings that started to seem to be happening. It seemed like it was a new phenomenon, and part of what my book is there to tell now, with some updated material in the introduction and in the epilogue, is that this has been going on forever. This story I'm telling is a 1975 killing in Boston, a black man shot in the back of the head. And that these kinds of stories have been going on forever, but they pre-existed cable news and the internet, and now everyone having a camera in our pocket where we can capture video, as they did in East Pittsburgh recently, of a kid running away from a police officer being shot in the back. And because that video was captured on someone's phone, that officer actually got charged with criminal homicide, which absolutely could not happen back in the dark day that I was writing about in Boston. And it's very much a Boston story. It's a very dramatic story. We actually turned it into a CBS TV movie back in the 1980s because the book had all these dramatic elements as well as this important story of a social problem to illuminate. And actually, when I started writing the book, 1980, I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times about the problems associated with police use of deadly force, and it was 1979, November. That was the very first time the New York Times in print ever said that there can be problems in the way police use their guns. First time in the history of the newspaper. And so in 1975, when James Bowden was killed in Roxbury, his widow eventually found her way to my father, who had been a Boston cop. He was a Boston cop when I was born, and he put himself through Suffolk College and Suffolk Law School nights while he was working full-time as a cop, and he became a lawyer. And he became a really good, tough courtroom lawyer. And Mrs. Bowden found her way to him, and he immediately took the case and mounted his very first civil rights case. Because as an ex-cop, as soon as he saw the elements of this story, he knew this was a bad shooting and really bad police work, to put it mildly. My brother Michael was his co-counsel with him on the case. He's sitting in the front row here tonight. They engaged, and I was along there to help him, as was my brother Kevin, who's here too, a multi-year quest that went to a trial before an all-white jury in Boston, which my father won. Then the police appealed it to the United States Supreme Court, went to trial again. My father won it again in front of an all-white jury. And so this is the very dramatic, up-close, very Boston Irish story of the way things were in the way American police officers used their guns. And it's a very troubling story about how much has not changed, an encouraging story about how much has. I mean, one thing that has changed that I think is great is that Bill Evans, the current Boston police commissioner, who went to the same high school that I did, is the kind of police leader that I personally believe would not allow this to happen again in his police department. And so that's a great kind of individualized, localized progress. The other part of it that is fundamental and that is deeply disturbing is this attitude, this police attitude, which has not changed, about these kinds of incidents. And that is the way most police responding to these incidents react to them. And it's not just the shooters who make the mistakes, either out of fear or panic or anger or whatever it is. And by the way, most police shootings are good. Let me just get that statistically. Let me get that picture clear. Most of them are good, and most of them do involve someone with a gun who's trying to kill them. But the bad ones are the ones we're talking about. And so I had a baseball coach when I was a kid, a guy named Billy Dwyer, and he was a Boston cop. And Billy was one of the cops who was on Smith Street in Roxbury when James Bowden was killed. Billy did not fire his gun, but he was there. And we ended up in this war with all the cops in this story for years, including Billy Dwyer. And I had some really tough times with him, and to put it mildly. And there even came a time when Billy Dwyer and another cop grabbed me in Boston and arrested me and beat me up. This was all part of their way of trying to scare my father off the case. Didn't work. made us all a little bit more excited to work on this case. But anyway, in the ways of the Boston Irish, which I cannot explain to you, I can't. At the end of this story, Billy Dwyer and I and some of my brothers are standing in a hallway in a federal courthouse. And now a second jury has said that this was a civil rights violation. James Bowden was wrongfully killed. And we're talking to Billy Dwyer about it. He was involved in the case. And this becomes the last page of the book because it's the inexplicable part. Billy, who grew up in Dorchester in an Irish neighborhood just like mine, coaching kids like me in baseball. I grew up in the same place. And Billy says to me as we're standing there, he says, of course it was a bad shooting. We all knew it was a bad shooting. But I had nothing to do with it, so I didn't give a shit. And so you have these two people from the same place who came out of the same environment, and one of them is standing there, having devoted years as part of a team to this crusade against this horrible injustice that has to be dealt with. And there's another one, same kind of guy, same kind of place, doesn't give a shit. And that's the gap. That's the gap. Right there. And I have no idea how you close that gap between Billy and me. I don't know how you do that. But That's the gap that we're really trying to close, and the truth of it is, no one has ever figured out the words about how to close that gap.
Well done. Okay, so you want one more question? All right, one more question. I saw that hand back there.
Sorry, you're going to have to order some Deadly Force. It's in paperback, and get it in the store. I'll come back and sign some Deadly Forces at the store.
I wanted to ask you, do you think the Trump presidency is going to end before his first term? And if so, how?
This is the easiest question of the night. I have no idea. I know exactly what you know and no more. I've been holding nothing back. Don't think I've got a file down there at the office that I'm not telling you. Told you everything I know. I gave up predicting a week after I said the following thing. We're on Morning Joe, and the Republican primary, no votes cast yet in Republican primaries, but the field has been gathered, and they're kind of running polls on everybody. And Donald Trump has just gone in a couple of weeks from 3%. He and Bernie Sanders both started at 3. Trump goes from 3 to 6. And I was mildly surprised at that, but I thought, okay, so the white Herman Cain, okay, okay, I get it. And then that morning that I'm on Morning Joe, the big report is he's just doubled. He's just gone from 6 to 12. And people are using the word double, which sounds really impressive and dramatic. And I just think he went up 6 points. The margin of error is 3, so that's really a movement of 3 maximum. I think it's no big deal. And I say, well, you don't think he's going to go any higher than that? And I say it with this real hardcore authority that this candidacy is at 12, and that's the highest double digit it's ever going to get to. And a week later, it was at about 24, and I stopped predicting then.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much.
Big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.